people existed. That is the beginning. There was nothing particularly remarkable about their existence, except that it continued. People walked slowly, sometimes quickly, depending on how tired or motivated they were. They looked for food, because they needed food to avoid dying. The search for food consisted of moving from one location to another, inspecting the ground, and occasionally picking up objects that seemed edible. Sometimes they ate these objects. Sometimes they did not. When they did not eat them, they returned to searching, which was a repetitive process. People slept. Sleeping was necessary because it restored energy. They would lie down on the ground or on slightly more comfortable surfaces, if they could find them. Sleeping did not involve any great adventures. It involved closing eyes, remaining still, and breathing in a relatively predictable pattern. They slept, woke up, and often repeated this process. People used tools. Tools were made from stones, sticks, or bones. A stick could serve as a stick. A bone could serve as a bone. And a stone could serve as a stone. Occasionally, someone attempted to modify these objects to make them marginally more useful. These modifications were usually minor and did not lead to dramatic consequences. People carried the tools with them sometimes. Other times, they left them where they found them. People communicated. Communication involved sounds or gestures. These sounds and gestures had meanings that were generally understood by other people nearby. Sometimes, communication was extended over longer distances by repeating sounds, but this required attention and often failed to convey accurate information. Miscommunication was common, but it rarely caused anything particularly interesting. People formed groups. Groups varied in size, from a few individuals to many individuals. Larger groups sometimes required more coordination, but coordination mostly consisted of deciding who would go first in a line, who would carry a heavy object, or who would wait for whom. These decisions were usually tedious and rarely led to significant change in the overall group. People reproduced. Reproduction ensured that more people existed in the future. The process involved two individuals performing certain actions, after which it was expected that a new person might appear at some point in time. This process was neither surprising nor exciting, though it was necessary to maintain population levels. People moved. Movement was mostly horizontal. They did not fly. They did not swim unless necessary. They moved to places that offered food, safety, or comfort. Movement was usually slow. Occasionally, it was faster, but only when circumstances demanded. People often paused during movement to rest, eat, or look around. Looking around consumed time, but rarely led to anything notable. People discovered fire. Fire was discovered. It produced warmth, light, and the ability to cook food. People were careful with fire because it could burn things. Sometimes, things burned anyway. People adjusted. They used fire for warmth, cooking, and light. Fire did not solve all problems. People still slept, still looked for food, and still moved from place to place. People invented farming. Farming involved planting seeds in soil and waiting. Waiting was a significant part of farming. During the waiting, people often monitored the growth of plants. Plants grew slowly. They required water, sunlight, and protection from animals. Farming allowed people to remain in one place for longer periods, which reduced the amount of movement but increased the amount of waiting. People built simple shelters. Shelters were made from wood, stone, leaves, or combinations thereof. Shelters provided protection from weather. They did not prevent boredom. People still slept, ate, communicated, and occasionally adjusted the shelter if it leaked or fell apart. Shelters were neither particularly exciting nor dangerous once built. People created tools for farming. These tools included sticks for digging, stones for grinding, and containers for holding water or seeds. Tools were used repeatedly. Sometimes they broke. Broken tools were replaced with new tools, which was a repetitive but necessary process. People formed larger groups called communities. Communities required more coordination. Coordination included determining who would farm, who would gather, and who would build. Leadership positions existed, but the responsibilities were mostly mundane: organizing schedules, distributing tools, and making sure people did not argue excessively. People traded. Trade involved exchanging objects, mostly things that were useful. People traded food, tools, and occasionally decorative objects. Trade required agreement on value. Disagreements were resolved through negotiation, which was generally slow and unexciting. People experienced seasons. Seasons affected daily routines. Some seasons were cold, requiring more fire. Some seasons were warm, requiring more shade. Some seasons produced more food naturally, while others produced less. After people had established simple shelters and started farming, life continued mostly the same. Days consisted of waking up, checking crops, collecting water, and occasionally repairing shelters. Nothing dramatic happened on most days. People occasionally encountered small problems, such as a tool breaking, a seed not sprouting, or an animal wandering into the crops. These problems required minor attention, but did not disrupt the overall slow pace of life. People discovered that certain plants could be eaten without negative effects, while others caused discomfort. Knowledge about which plants were safe was passed slowly, often by observing the effects on others. Observation took time and required patience. Occasionally, someone made a mistake and became ill, but recovery was also slow and largely uneventful. People continued to communicate. Communication methods evolved very slightly. Some symbols were painted on walls or carved into wood. These symbols were used to indicate numbers, directions, or locations of resources. People occasionally misinterpreted symbols, but the misinterpretation was rarely catastrophic. Misinterpretations were corrected over long periods of observation. Communities grew slowly. As more people were born, the number of individuals in a single place increased. Larger communities required slightly more coordination. Meetings were held to decide who would farm which field, who would gather water, and who would tend to animals. Meetings were often repetitive and unexciting. Decisions were made very cautiously and then recorded by marking stones or sticks. People began to notice patterns in nature. Seasons repeated in predictable cycles. Animals migrated predictably. Plants grew according to certain conditions. People adjusted their schedules to these patterns. Life became slightly more organized, but still monotonous. People experimented with pottery. Pottery was useful for holding water, storing food, or carrying objects. Making pottery involved shaping clay, drying it, and sometimes using fire to harden it. Each step required careful attention, but the process was repetitive. Pottery could crack if not handled properly, which meant repeating the process slowly. Trade became slightly more common. Communities occasionally exchanged tools, food, or pottery with neighboring groups. The process of trade required negotiation. Negotiation was slow and involved repetitive gestures, sounds, or markings to agree on value. Sometimes trade failed, but the failure was not exciting. Successful trade allowed people to have items they did not produce themselves, which slightly diversified their monotonous routines. People discovered metals. Metals could be shaped into tools or ornaments. Using metals involved heating rocks, pounding them, and shaping them carefully. The process was slow and repetitive. Metal